The world stood on the brink of something it had never seen before. Steel machines roared across continents, skies thundered with the cries of bombers, and humanity itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of its own creation. War was no longer about swords or courage. It was about domination through innovation. Every nation that entered the conflict believed it could outthink, outbuild, and outlast the other. But what none of them realized was that the greatest battle was not being fought on the fields or in the skies. It was being fought inside the human mind. In the early months, everything was driven by confidence. The propaganda machines painted their countries as invincible, their armies as unstoppable. Every poster, every radio speech, every parade, crafted not to inform, but to hypnotize. People weren't just fighting for territory, they were fighting for belief. Nations used stories as weapons, pride as fuel, and for a time, it worked. Entire populations marched willingly into chaos, convinced that glory was waiting on the other side. But beneath the roar of engines and the cheers of crowds, silence began to grow. Soldiers started realizing that the stories they were told didn't match the reality they were living. The mud didn't care about ideology. The bullets didn't distinguish between the brave and the fearful. Every explosion ripped away another layer of illusion. Slowly, the war began revealing its true face, not one of honor or patriotism, but of exhaustion and despair. That's when the first cracks appeared. The commanders sitting miles away still believed in victory, but the men on the ground had stopped believing in anything. Letters sent home became shorter. Smiles in the trenches became rare. The human heart, once full of faith, was now filled with doubt. And doubt is contagious. Yet, in every dark corner of war, there were still flickers of humanity. Soldiers sharing a cigarette under a broken sky. Enemies silently agreeing not to shoot at each other for a few minutes. Medics risking their lives to save the wounded from both sides. These moments didn't make headlines, but they were what truly defined the war. Because even as nations tried to erase empathy, the human soul refused to obey. As technology advanced, so did destruction. Air raids turned cities into ashes overnight. Entire generations were erased in seconds. But the more power humans built, the more powerless they began to feel. The war had escaped everyone's control. It was no longer about who was right. It was about who was left. By the third year, strategies began to collapse. The same leaders who once spoke with certainty now spoke in panic. Every decision carried the weight of millions of lives, and every mistake echoed louder than the last. The people watching from home started asking questions. Why are we still fighting? What are we dying for? The answers never came. Governments silenced those questions because silence was safer than truth. And then, something unexpected began to happen. The illusion of power started to crumble. Soldiers no longer marched for pride. They marched because they had no choice. Civilians no longer cheered. They simply endured. Every nation that once dreamed of empire now only dreamed of survival. The war that began as a quest for victory had transformed into a struggle for existence. In that chaos, something powerful emerged, a collective realization. No matter how strong a country's weapons were, no matter how vast its armies, there was one thing no general could control: the human will to question. When people stop believing in the stories that justify destruction, the war loses its purpose. And that's exactly what was happening. Beneath the rubble, beneath the ashes, beneath the orders shouted through static radios, a quiet rebellion was forming. Not through guns or protests, but through awakening. The kind that doesn't make noise, but changes everything. Because sometimes, the most dangerous weapon in any war is truth. The war had grown beyond borders, beyond maps, beyond comprehension. Every sunrise carried a new headline. Every nightfall buried another truth. The earth itself seemed tired, its fields soaked with rain and blood, its cities turned to dust and memory. What had started as a battle for dominance was now a storm swallowing everything in its path. And inside that storm, humanity was learning its most painful lesson. That power without conscience is a weapon that turns on its own creator. Factories thundered day and night, churning out machines of death faster than farmers could grow food. Smoke stained the skies black, blocking the stars that once guided travelers home. In the name of progress, men built engines that could fly higher, bombs that could fall faster, and guns that could kill from miles away. They called it innovation. But the truth was darker. It was desperation disguised as glory. Nations were no longer building for victory. They were building to keep from falling apart. Inside the barracks, silence carried more weight than the sound of marching boots. Soldiers whispered about home in voices trembling with both hope and fear. Some carried photographs that had already faded. Others carried letters they couldn't bear to read. Every heartbeat was a reminder that they were alive, but not truly living. And yet, even in their exhaustion, orders kept coming. Attack. Advance. Hold the line. As if repeating those words could hold together a world that was already broken. Far from the front lines, the leaders stood before microphones, their speeches echoing through radios in every household. Their words painted victory as inevitable, sacrifice as noble, and death as honorable. But those listening began to hear something else, something hollow. The voice that once inspired confidence now carried the tremor of fear. The facade was cracking. And when a lie starts to sound like a lie, its power begins to fade. Civilians began to see the war for what it truly was. Mothers who had once proudly sent their sons to fight now wept in silence. Children grew up not with lullabies, but with the sound of air raid sirens. The concept of home changed. It was no longer a place of safety, but a place that could vanish overnight. Survival became the only religion, and truth the only forbidden word. There were those who still believed in duty, who fought because they must, not because they wanted to. And within that sense of obligation, a new kind of courage was born, the courage to endure. It wasn't loud, it wasn't heroic in the traditional sense, but it was unbreakable. Because when everything around you collapses, the act of simply standing your ground becomes its own victory. Yet, the higher the war climbed, the more meaningless victory became. Frontlines blurred, alliances shifted, and enemies became reflections of one another. On both sides of the battlefield, soldiers shared the same hunger, the same fear, the same yearning for peace. They were divided by flags, but united by suffering. It was in that shared pain that the illusion of difference began to fade. As the war dragged on, something inside humanity began to awaken. People started asking, not with words, but with their choices. A mechanic refused to build more tanks. A messenger delayed orders to save lives. A nurse treated an enemy soldier without hesitation. Each act was small, invisible in the chaos, but together, they formed the first quiet rebellion. It was no longer a fight between nations. It was a fight between humanity and the machine it had created. The machine that demanded sacrifice, obedience, and silence. But for the first time, silence was breaking. Because when people begin to think, control begins to die. The war machine had fed on fear for too long. But fear, like fire, consumes its own fuel. And when it burns out, all that remains is truth, and truth does not kneel. In the ruins of shattered cities, amid the smoke and cries, a new sound began to rise. It wasn't the roar of guns or the march of armies. It was the whisper of awakening. The realization that victory could no longer be measured in land or power, but in the survival of conscience itself. And that whisper would soon become the one thing the generals feared most. A sound no weapon could silence. Because the end of every war doesn't begin with peace, it begins with awareness. The world was now a theater of exhaustion. Every nation had bled itself dry. Every dream had been mortgaged to the machinery of war. The soldiers who once marched with conviction now dragged their boots through mud that smelled of decay and hopelessness. Each sunrise felt heavier than the last, not because of the battles to come, but because of the ones already lost inside their hearts. Victory was no longer the goal, survival was. Yet, even in ruin, the war demanded obedience. Commanders issued orders from maps that no longer made sense. Territories had become meaningless lines drawn across ashes. Still, the orders came: advance, defend, retaliate. But the men receiving them had changed. They had seen too much, lost too much, and believed too little. For the first time, the greatest threat to the war was not the enemy's strength, but its own soldiers' weariness. In the trenches, conversations had turned into confessions, no longer about politics or patriotism, but about regret. Regret for believing in promises made by men who would never face the front lines themselves. Regret for fighting enemies who were just as human, just as scared. Regret for realizing too late that none of them were truly free. The real chains were not forged from iron. They were made from belief. And then came the silence. Not the kind that follows an explosion, but the kind that precedes a revelation. Across battlefields, soldiers began to hesitate. Not out of fear, but reflection. They looked at their weapons and wondered what purpose they now served. They looked at their enemies and saw not monsters, but mirrors. War had stripped away the flags and the propaganda until only humanity remained, raw, fragile, and unbearably real. That's when the first deserters appeared, not cowards, but awakeners. Men who walked away from the front lines not because they gave up, but because they finally understood what they were fighting against. They weren't escaping war, they were escaping deception. And for every man who fled, hundreds began to think. And thought, in a time of tyranny, is more dangerous than any weapon. But the higher powers couldn't afford thought. They needed obedience, and obedience required fear. So, they turned to propaganda once again. New posters appeared. New speeches echoed through the radios. They spoke of honor, sacrifice, destiny. But this time, the words didn't land. They bounced off a population that had already seen what destiny looked like up close. Bombed homes, starving children, and the graves of the innocent. The illusion was dying, and with it, the empire of control. Meanwhile, technology continued its relentless evolution. Airplanes grew faster, bombs grew stronger, and death grew quieter. The skies, once a symbol of freedom, had become the new battlefield. Civilians looked up not to admire clouds, but to predict their doom. Every shadow that passed overhead could mean annihilation. It was here that humanity realized the paradox it had created. It had learned to fly, only to use those wings to destroy itself. And yet, amidst the smoke and ruin, hope refused to vanish. Somewhere between the sirens and the screams, acts of compassion continued to surface. A soldier sharing his last piece of bread with a hungry child. A pilot dropping food instead of bombs. A nurse risking her life to save strangers in a collapsing hospital. These moments didn't change the course of the war, but they reminded the world that it hadn't lost everything. Not yet. In the ruins of a destroyed city, a single piece of graffiti began appearing on walls. We remember. No one knew who wrote it, or when it started, but it spread like wildfire. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about victory. It was about acknowledgement. About the unspoken truth that history was being written in blood, and someone had to remember, or else it would all happen again. And so, as the war dragged into its next phase, something subtle yet unstoppable began to move beneath the surface. The rebellion wasn't organized. It had no leader, no flag, no anthem. It was made of whispers, glances, and choices. The kind of rebellion that grows quietly, patiently, until one day, it changes everything. Because even when a war consumes the world, it cannot consume the conscience forever. The human spirit, when cornered by despair, doesn't always surrender. Sometimes it evolves. And evolution, once it begins, cannot be controlled. By now, the war had become something unrecognizable. It was no longer a clash of nations. It was a collision of madness. Borders had dissolved under the weight of destruction, and ideologies that once seemed unshakable now felt like distant illusions. The entire world had become a battlefield, not divided by geography, but by belief, by fear, and by the desperate need to justify the chaos. Cities once vibrant with life now stood as hollow monuments to pride. Streets were filled not with people, but with echoes, echoes of laughter, of conversations, of futures that would never arrive. Even nature seemed to recoil. The forests that once whispered with wind were now graves of steel and ash. The sky carried not the song of birds, but the constant hum of engines and the thunder of bombs. The earth had grown tired of mankind's arrogance, yet still, it endured, watching quietly as humanity burned its own reflection. In the heart of this devastation, propaganda reached its breaking point. It had been the invisible weapon that sustained the war's fire, convincing millions to fight for glory that never existed. But now, the posters looked like mockery. The slogans that once inspired faith now only provoked anger. People began tearing them down, not out of rebellion, but out of exhaustion. There was nothing left to believe in. The governments tried to silence the growing unrest, labeling truth as treason. But words, once freed, cannot be imprisoned. From the whispers of soldiers to the writings of poets, from the reports of journalists to the diaries of civilians, the truth began to spread. Quietly, dangerously, irreversibly. Every story told, every letter smuggled out, every testimony given became a bullet fired at the machinery of lies. And that's when fear shifted sides. For the first time, it wasn't the people who feared their rulers. It was the rulers who feared their people. They feared the power of realization, the one force no army could conquer. Because a population that no longer believes is more powerful than 1,000 divisions armed to the teeth. And across the world, disbelief was spreading like wildfire. The soldiers on the front lines began questioning their missions. Why were they ordered to destroy villages that had no strategic value? Why were they told to fight men who looked as broken as they did? The more they asked, the less the answers made sense. Orders became harder to follow, loyalty harder to fake. The war machine began to tremble from within, not because of enemy attacks, but because its gears no longer wanted to turn. Meanwhile, civilians were no longer silent spectators. Underground networks formed, not for espionage or sabotage, but for preservation. They hid books, protected artworks, and documented everything the censors tried to erase. They knew that someday, someone would need to know what really happened. They weren't just surviving the war, they were preserving the truth of it. Because the greatest threat to tyranny isn't revolution, it's memory. Somewhere amidst the chaos, humanity started to reawaken. Not in the speeches of politicians or the strategies of generals, but in the smallest gestures. A soldier refusing to pull the trigger. A mother sharing her last piece of bread with a stranger. A prisoner forgiving his captor. These moments didn't end the war, but they began something far more powerful. Healing. The transformation wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden, but it was unstoppable. The same fire that once destroyed was now lighting the path forward. For centuries, humanity had built weapons to win wars. Now, it was learning how to build compassion to end them. And as the war machine continued to crumble, one truth began to emerge from the smoke. A truth no nation wanted to admit, yet none could deny. The real enemy had never been another country. It had always been within us. Our arrogance, our hatred, our blindness to one another's humanity. Once that truth surfaced, the world could no longer go back to the way it was. Because after witnessing the depth of its own darkness, humanity would have to choose, evolve or vanish. The end of war was no longer a question of treaties or victory. It was a question of survival, not of nations, but of conscience. Because there comes a moment in every civilization when it must decide whether to keep fighting or start healing. And that moment had arrived. The war had reached a stage where even victory felt like defeat. Cities were reclaimed only to reveal ruins. Armies advanced only to find emptiness. The leaders stood before their nations and called it triumph, but their eyes betrayed them. Behind every speech, behind every carefully chosen word, there was something missing: certainty. The kind of certainty they once used to control millions. It had vanished, consumed by the very chaos they unleashed. Across the continents, the silence of disbelief replaced the sound of celebration. The people no longer clapped for their leaders. They listened, measured, and remembered. They had learned that every promise built in war was a debt that would be paid by the innocent. And this time, they were done paying. Factories once built to arm soldiers now stood abandoned, haunted by the echo of machines that once defined progress. The same hands that had forged weapons were now rebuilding homes, piecing together what was left of humanity. But the hardest reconstruction wasn't of buildings, it was of trust. Nations could be rebuilt with labor and time, but faith, that was different. Faith, once broken, leaves scars no treaty can heal. In the ashes of what was left, people began to face an unfamiliar kind of silence, the silence after destruction. It wasn't peace yet, but it was the first time in years that the guns had stopped. And in that quiet, the true cost of the war began to speak. Not through history books or statistics, but through eyes. The eyes of children who had forgotten what laughter sounded like. The eyes of mothers who still waited for letters that would never come. The eyes of soldiers who had survived, but could never return to who they were. The war had created a new kind of human, one who no longer believed in glory, but in truth. And that truth was raw. It wasn't dressed in flags or anthems. It didn't belong to any nation. It belonged to everyone who had suffered and still dared to hope. Governments tried to rewrite the story, to make sense of the senseless, to turn pain into narrative. They needed to preserve pride. But people no longer wanted stories. They wanted honesty. And honesty is dangerous in a world built on denial. The historians who spoke too openly were silenced. The artists who painted what they saw were censored. The survivors who told the truth were ignored. But silence, once again, failed. Because truth has a way of surviving, just like humanity itself. Somewhere in the ruins of Europe, a soldier wrote in his journal, "We fought for the future. We forgot to imagine what it would look like." That line, simple yet devastating, began circulating in underground circles. It became a mirror, reflecting the shared guilt of a generation that had destroyed the world to save it. It was no longer about who won the war. It was about who would dare to remember it correctly. The world began dividing again, not by alliances, but by conscience. On one side were those who wanted to forget, to erase the shame and start anew. On the other were those who insisted on remembering, no matter how painful it was. Between them stood a fragile humanity, unsure which path would lead to redemption. Because forgetting might bring comfort, but remembering brings change. Meanwhile, the soldiers returning home carried more than wounds. They carried stories that the world wasn't ready to hear. They spoke of senseless orders, meaningless deaths, and moments of humanity in the heart of horror. They spoke of enemies who saved lives and commanders who wasted them. And their testimonies began to crack open the official narrative. For every truth suppressed, 10 more surfaced. A strange paradox began to emerge. The war, which had started as a battle for power, was ending as a lesson in humility. Humanity had reached its highest peak of destruction and found nothing there. It had conquered everything except its own nature. And that realization hit harder than any bomb. Out of this despair, a question began to echo across the ruins. What now? It wasn't a question of politics or economics. It was a question of identity. Who were they, now that the masks had fallen? What did civilization mean after proving itself capable of such cruelty? The answers would not come easily. But perhaps, for the first time, humanity was finally ready to ask the right questions. Because sometimes, the beginning of peace is not the absence of war. It's the courage to confront what war reveals. And as the dust settled, that courage was all the world had left. The silence that followed the war was not peaceful. It was heavy, uneasy, and filled with ghosts. The world had stopped fighting, but it hadn't started healing. Everywhere, ruins stood like scars carved into the earth, reminding humanity of what it had done to itself. And though the guns were finally quiet, their echoes still lived in the minds of those who survived. Peace, they discovered, was not the end of war. It was the beginning of memory. The victors gathered in grand halls, signing documents, shaking hands, promising never to repeat the horrors that had unfolded. But the ink on those treaties dried faster than the blood in the streets. Words came easily, change did not. For every declaration of unity, there was still division. For every speech about peace, there were whispers of revenge. The human heart, it seemed, was not built to forget so easily. Yet, beneath the surface, something profound was shifting. The people, the ones who had carried the burden of war without ever holding a weapon, had begun to see through the illusions of power. They no longer looked at leaders with awe, but with caution. They no longer trusted flags to define their morality. For the first time in centuries, ordinary men and women understood the cost of blind obedience. And that understanding was dangerous, because awareness is the seed of change. Nations began to face questions they had long buried. Who was responsible? Who should be held accountable? The generals, the politicians, the ideologues, all stood under the weight of scrutiny. Trials were held, evidence presented, horrors revealed. The truth spilled out like a wound reopening, raw and unfiltered. The world was forced to look itself in the mirror, and what it saw was terrifying. Because war wasn't just a collective madness, it was a collective choice. People wanted justice, but justice proved more complicated than vengeance. How do you punish a system that lives inside every nation, every institution, every human heart? The trials could hang individuals, but they couldn't hang ideology. They could convict men, but not mindsets. That realization burned deeper than any verdict. The evil they fought was not an empire or an army. It was the arrogance that had lived among them all along. Meanwhile, survivors began to tell their stories. Some spoke to forget, others to ensure the world would never forget again. Their testimonies turned into books, their memories into monuments. Every word they spoke was a warning written in pain. It started with pride and ended with ashes. Generations to come would study their words in classrooms, but only those who lived it knew the truth. No book could ever capture the weight of watching humanity destroy itself. In the ashes of fallen regimes, art began to rise again. Painters, poets, and filmmakers became the new historians. Their work didn't celebrate war, it dissected it. Every brushstroke, every verse, every frame became a reflection of guilt and grief. Through them, the world began to see what official history could not show: the emotional cost, the moral decay, the quiet resilience that statistics ignored. But even as the world promised never again, shadows still lingered. New nations rose from old empires, each carrying fragments of ambition that once fueled the fires. Armies were rebuilt under the name of defense. Weapons evolved, sharper and faster than before. Humanity had learned from its mistakes, but only how to repeat them more efficiently. The peace that followed was not born from wisdom. It was born from exhaustion. And exhaustion is temporary. Still, there was something different this time. A small, persistent voice had begun to echo across generations. A voice that questioned, doubted, challenged. The voice of remembrance. It belonged not to leaders, but to ordinary people, the survivors, the educators, the thinkers, the children who grew up among ruins. They carried the weight of truth, and with it, the responsibility to ensure the silence that followed war would never become forgetfulness. Because forgetting is how wars are born again. And so, the world stood at a crossroads, not between nations, but between memory and denial. It could rebuild itself in the image of its old arrogance, or it could choose something new, something fragile, uncertain, but hopeful. For the first time, humanity understood that peace was not a gift, it was work. Relentless, unending work. The kind that demanded honesty, humility, and the courage to remember. The world had learned to destroy. Now, it had to learn to deserve survival. The final days of the war unfolded not on the battlefield, but in the minds of those who had survived it. The men who once fought with conviction now stared into silence, questioning what any of it truly meant. The world had been reshaped, not by victory or defeat, but by the sheer weight of destruction that no one had anticipated. Europe was no longer the same continent. It was a graveyard of ambition and ideology. The ruins spoke louder than any speech, reminding everyone that power gained through violence only guarantees a future haunted by its consequences. As the smoke settled over what remained of cities, a new kind of battle began, one fought with memory and truth. Every nation started to build its own version of history, twisting facts to justify what had been done. Governments called it reconstruction, but it was really rehabilitation of conscience. Soldiers were called heroes, leaders were mourned, and the dead were turned into symbols. Yet beneath the polished marble of memorials lay a darker truth, the silence of those who knew what really happened but couldn't speak of it. The world had learned to glorify pain rather than prevent it. The war had also birthed a new form of humanity, one that had seen the worst and yet refused to stop believing in hope. People began to rebuild from the ashes, driven by an instinct deeper than reason. They built homes where bombs had fallen, planted gardens in the craters of artillery shells, and tried to teach their children that peace was possible. But the shadows of the past never vanished. Every sound of thunder reminded them of air raids. Every political speech echoed with the tone of old propaganda. They had survived, but they had not escaped. As nations gathered to sign treaties and establish new alliances, the irony was impossible to ignore. The same men who had ordered millions to die now spoke of unity and human rights. The world wanted peace, but it was already sowing the seeds of the next conflict. Economic recovery turned into rivalry. Ideological walls began to rise again, this time not made of concrete, but of fear and mistrust. The war had ended, but the machinery that created it was still alive, waiting for another trigger. Humanity had rebuilt its cities, but not its morals. In the midst of this fragile calm, a new generation emerged, children who had never seen the front lines but inherited the trauma of those who did. They grew up in a world of caution, where every decision was shadowed by the memory of catastrophe. For them, the war was not a story of bravery, it was a warning. They carried the burden of remembering what their parents wanted to forget. It was this generation that would later question everything: the system, the leaders, the very idea of patriotism. Out of their questions rose a quiet revolution of thought that would redefine the meaning of power itself. Yet, history has a strange way of repeating itself when lessons are not learned deeply enough. Decades later, the drums of war would echo again, in different lands, under different flags. The reasons would change: freedom, justice, defense, but the pattern remained the same. Propaganda returned, disguised as patriotism. The media once again became a weapon, and truth once again became a casualty. Humanity's greatest tragedy was not that it fought wars, but that it never truly stopped preparing for them. In the final reckoning, the story of war is not about nations or leaders, it's about people. The soldier who never came home, the mother who refused to stop waiting, the child who learned to spell bomb before peace. These are the real chapters of history, the ones that never make it into textbooks. They remind us that victory is temporary, but loss is eternal. They remind us that every monument built to honor the fallen also stands as a warning to the living. And so, as the world moves forward, the echoes of that great war still linger. They live in the silence between gunfire and negotiation, in the space between memory and denial. The future, once again, depends on the same fragile question that haunted the survivors. Will humanity finally learn, or will it rebuild only to destroy again? The answer remains unwritten, waiting not in history books, but in the choices we make next.